beat now, it's pulling me in. Meet me at midnight. Oh yeah, oh yeah. If you're ready to get down, bring your friends. Meet me at midnight. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Down on your knees, you're begging, please, you want it. My love's like fire, yeah, it'll leave you burning. Down on your knees, you're begging, please, you want it.
It is not just about music anymore. Today I'm talking about what podcasters need to know about copyright before using any third-party content in their shows. Welcome to Legit Podcast Pro. Whether or not you look at podcasting as a hobby or as a side hustle or as your main business, this show is for you because making a great podcast is all about approaching podcasting like a pro. You take your sound quality seriously, you take your content and your message seriously, and yes, you take your business and your approach to everything related to your podcast seriously. So on this podcast, I am answering your questions. I'm sharing legal and business topics around the podcast arena, and I'm interviewing legit podcast pros just like you. So join me each week, live on social or by subscribing to the podcast in your favorite podcatcher. And today's topic is that. It's not just about music anymore. We're talking about copyright and what podcasters need to know about it before using any third-party content on your show. Because using third-party material in your podcast is a very popular thing. You're doing a reaction show to a television program, or you want to bring in a little music or something like that, or you're talking about clips that you saw on social media, whatever. What do I mean by third-party material? Well, all I mean by that is really just that it's material that you didn't originate yourself, that you didn't create originally yourself. So that film clip, that podcast, that piece of music, whatever. It's not just about music. Now, in order to get into this topic, we need to start with just a little bit of basics about copyright law. What is a copyright? Well, copyright is a constitutionally mandated bundle of rights that Congress is giving to us. The Constitution says Congress shall create this law, and Congress did it. It's designed to protect authors' rights in their work for exclusive rights for a limited amount of time. The idea being that that's how we stimulate and incentivize the act of creation in the first place. By giving authors, creators exclusive rights, they can monetize that and turn it into money, which is pretty good. But it's a limited time. Eventually it expires. That way those who come after can work from the material that's gone before them. Unfortunately, it's a very long time these days, but still. So a copyright is this bundle of rights. There are 5 rights total. One is the right to make copies of the work. One is the right to distribute those copies of the work. One is the right to make derivative works based on the original thing. That's things that are based on or derived from. And then there are the rights to perform the work in public and or display the work in public. So we've got that 5-component bundle of rights, and they can be divided up and shared in various different ways among territories or languages or time frames and all that kind of good stuff. Now, to get a copyright, in order to be entitled to these exclusive rights, all one must do is the act of authorship. Create something original and fix it in a tangible form. Record it on digital or tape, write it on paper, paint it on canvas, carve it in stone, punch holes in a roll of paper that can be reproduced and played on a player piano. All of those things. If it's original work, you're entitled to a copyright. All you have to do is create it. Don't have to register it. Don't have to put any particular notice on it. Don't have to do anything. You own a copyright. The protection is essentially automatic from the moment you create that work. And that's pretty awesome. Now, the copyright, as we said, it's a limited time, but it's a good, long, limited time. Copyright protection under modern law since 1978, any work created after January 1st of 1978, is the copyright is valid for the life of the author plus 70 years. Works created by companies, 120 years from the date they're created, or 95 years from the date they're first published. Likewise, works that were created prior to 1978 go back 95 years, right? So anything created more than 95 years ago is in the public domain. Anything created less than 95 years, there's a really good chance it's protected by copyright. And what that means is that the author or the owners, if it's been transferred by sale or assignment or by a will or something like that, the owners of those copyrights have the exclusive right to allow that copying, that distribution, that making of derivative works, performance, and displaying of the work. So using copyrighted material without permission, a license from the owner, is infringement. So think about that. When you make a podcast, what are you doing? You're embodying that work within your own or basing the work on that, right? That's a derivative work. You're copying it when you allow it to be downloaded. You're distributing it when you publish and syndicate it available for either downloads or streams. And when you stream it, that's a performance, a public performance. So all of those things amount to infringement of copyright if you use someone else's stuff in your episode, unless it qualifies as fair use. Now, fair use is a topic for another day. In fact, I'll talk about it next week. But suffice it to say right here, it's probably not fair use. There are a very limited set of circumstances that I think a podcast episode is likely to be considered fair use. Now, that said, when you use third-party material in your podcast, you are using copyrighted material. It is not just about music, but we'll start the conversation talking about music. You see, with music, there are two copyrights we have to consider. After all, someone sat down and wrote that song. That songwriter created a musical composition. That composition is a work of creative authorship that's fixed in a tangible form. Therefore, it's a copyrightable work. But then some artists, a record company and a studio, they got together and made a recording of that song. Well, that recording is itself a copyrightable work. Yes, it's a derivative work of the composition, so they should have had permission to do it. At least the first time out, there's a special wrinkle there. But so that recording is an authorized derivative work, but it's also itself a copyrightable work protected under the law. So when we want to use a recorded piece of music in our podcast episode, we need to get a bunch of different rights, and it's not all from the same people. We need to get what's called a synchronization right, for the right to incorporate the music and lyrics into our show. That's the composition. But then we also need to get the right to use the recording, which we call a master use license. And that's for the right to incorporate the recording into our new product, our derivative work, our episode. And then we need to get a public performance right for the composition to be streamed or presented publicly. And finally, because podcasting is distributed digitally, we also need to get a public performance right license from the owner of the recording for the purpose of streaming that digital performance, that over a streaming service. And unfortunately, what this means is it's four-stop shopping, because these rights aren't all held by one or even two parties. The sync rights are going to be held by either the songwriter or the music publishing company that owns the song, that buys the song from the composer. The master use license comes from the record company, or sometimes the artists own their masters. The public performance right for the composition, that's licensed by an organization called a performing rights organization. Here in the United States, those rights organizations are ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR, stands for Global Music Rights. You need to get permission from them. That's usually handled by the streaming platform or something like that, but not always. And the public performance digital recordings right, there's no public performance rights in sound recordings that are not transmitted digitally over terrestrial radio. But because we're podcasting, it's a digital transmission, and that we need a license for the public performance of the recording as well. So I said it's not just for music, but music is the poster child for this. Four-stop shopping, 4 different sets of rights that you need from at least 2, more like 4 usually, entities or organizations. Those digital performance rights for recordings are handled by an organization called Sound Exchange. So you got to go 4 places. Now, sometimes the record company and the publisher can give you the rights to the performances as well. Each deal is a little different on that front. All right. So why do I say it's not just for music anymore? Well, lots of podcasts are using other stuff, clips from a movie that they're reviewing or talking about or reacting to. Those film clips are copyrighted works. Spoken word or comedy routines, again, those kinds of things are copyrightable works. Now, the spoken word and comedy routines is an area where just recently some new organizations have started arriving on the scene and begun claiming that certain channels' use of comedy recordings need to be accompanied by royalty payments. Very much like ASCAP and BMI collect royalties for music performances, these organizations are saying, hey, Spotify, hey, iHeart, hey, whoever else, Amazon, you got to pay us royalties because someone wrote that joke. Someone created that comedy routine. So that's like the composer or the songwriter. And that person needs to get paid for that work. And then someone else made a recording of that routine or joke. Maybe it was HBO for this HBO special and the soundtrack has been peeled off and is being used as a separate recording. Maybe it was a record deal. Okay. So again, we have the two different copyrights, largely owned by different people. And again, we have to license the synchronization right in the joke or routine, the master use right in the recording, the digital public performance of the recording, and the public performance of the literary material, the joke or routine itself. And an added wrinkle here is that unlike music, where a band can come along and cover a composition, make their own recording of it, you can't make your own version of a joke or a comedy routine without direct permission. There's no compulsory license that gives comedians the right to make covers of prior comedians' works. So you can't just do your own version by telling the joke live on your podcast, just in order to save a little money, right? Okay, so you've got the sync, the master use, the public performance of the joke or comedy routine, and the digital public performance of the master recording. Same thing, four-stop shopping, really kind of a pain. Now, film clips, I mentioned earlier. Film clips is an area where it's a little easier because usually the film company owns everything that you need and they can license it all in one fell swoop. But the exception is when there's film score, because that music may or may not be owned separately by the composer or by a music publisher, or it could be owned by the film company. So you have to ask the right questions. What other kinds of third-party material make their way into podcasts? Well, literature. You'd be surprised how often I hear from someone who wants to read from a book. Or poetry. You read a whole poem or a sonnet or something like that. Well, if it's a modern work and it's still protected by copyright, we have the same issues. Now, if there is a pre-existing recording, let's say we're listening to, I don't know, some famous actress recording the poem by some famous poet or not so famous poet. Again, we have the poem, which is the literary work. We have the recording of that, which is the sound recording or master. And again, we have those four different ways that it needs to be licensed: the synchronization, the master use, and the two different streaming licenses. So that's why I say it's not just about music anymore. Now, next week, I'm going to be diving into the other side of this, and that is the defense of fair use, sometimes also thought of as an excuse for copyright infringement. It is not an exception. It is a defense. If it qualifies as fair use, then it's not considered infringement. And we're also going to talk about parodies and certain kind of show reaction style shows and how that fits into this. So tune in again next week. That's it for this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. Before I go there, I do want to just mention to you that Legit Podcast Pro is brought to you by the Facebook group, Legit Podcast Pro. You can join us by visiting legitpodcastpro.com. It's free. We're talking about these kinds of issues all the time, and I would really be glad to have you become a part of the group. And with that, I'll say thanks for being here. Thank you for watching or listening, and tune in next week to Legit Podcast Pro when we'll be talking about fair use and parody and those kinds of things. Have a great week.